Hey guys, it's Manaswi Agrawal, a second year student, and the topic that I'm going to be talking about today is retroperitoneal space and its contents. There's also a final question based on this topic, so there's everything in this video that you need to know in order to ace your final question. The topics that we'll be doing today are abdominal cavity and its overview, including its location and its division. Then there is an explanation on what peritoneal cavity is and why is it so important. Then retroperitoneal space and its further division into three other spaces, and embryology of the retroperitoneal organs, which is also very important to know. And the last slide ends with a mnemonic that will help you remember all the retroperitoneal organs. Now, before we start with retroperitoneal space, let's talk a little about abdominal cavity. Abdominal cavity, as you can see in this picture right here, is the largest hollow space of the body, that is when all the organs are removed. It is a part of the abdominal pelvic cavity located below the thoracic cavity and above the pelvic cavity. This cavity is enclosed with diaphragm on its superior side, the upper plane of the pelvic cavity on its inferior side, abdominal musculature on its anterior side, lumbar spine, along with a few deep muscles on the posterior side. Now, the abdominal cavity is further divided into two. On the diagram shown on your screen, which is the mid-sagittal section of the abdominal pelvic cavity, the blue area on your screen is the peritoneal cavity, and the red area behind or retro to it is your retroperitoneal cavity. As you can see, there's a black line that divides the two cavities. This line is the peritoneum, also called the peritoneal layer. The presence of this peritoneal layer forms the basic point of differentiation between the two spaces. This peritoneal layer surrounds all the borders of the peritoneal cavity but is present only on the anterior side of the retroperitoneal space. As you can see, this entire concept revolves around peritoneum. It's really important to understand what peritoneum is. Peritoneum is a double layer serous membrane that surrounds all the walls and the internal organs of the peritoneal cavity. Now, from histology, we know that there are two main types of epithelial membranes. Those are mucous membranes and the serous membranes. Mucous membranes line the body cavity that open to the exterior, like digestive tract, respiratory tract, excretory tract, and reproductive tracts. Serous membrane, on the other hand, line cavities that don't open directly to the outside. Now, the peritoneum can be divided into two: parietal and visceral. Parietal lines the abdominal and pelvic cavities, and the visceral wraps around the internal organs. You can visualize the relationship between the two serosal layers by pushing your fist into the balloon. The part of the balloon that clings to your fist corresponds to the visceral peritoneum, or visceral peritoneal layer that wraps around the external surface of the internal organs. And the outer part of the balloon corresponds to the parietal peritoneum. These two layers enclose a potential cavity between them, obviously called the peritoneal cavity, which is here, this hollow space here, and right here. A difference, no, before that, there's also a formation of mesentery, which is a double fold of the peritoneum, providing structural support to the organ. So in this case, this is the mesentery attached to the abdominal wall, providing structural support to the internal organs. A difference that can be spotted from this point is that the organs that are not supported by mesentery are the retroperitoneal organs, and those supported by the mesentery belong to the peritoneal space. Okay, before moving on, let's make sure we've understood the location of retroperitoneal space. This is the transverse section which is taken from here. You know, the kidneys are located at around T12 to L3, and the diaphragm is located at around T10, T8 to T10, I think. So that section should be taken from somewhere here. Okay. So this is the anterior layer formed by the posterior parietal peritoneum, and this is the posterior layer of the retroperitoneal space formed by the transversalis fascia. Alright? Now coming back to our next topic. I know this looks a little complicated, but I assure you it's not. So the retroperitoneal space can be further subdivided into the three spaces: the perirenal space, the anterior pararenal space, and the posterior pararenal space. The perirenal space, also called the perinephric space, is bounded by the anterior and posterior leaves of the renal fascia. These are also called Gerota's fascia and Zuckerkandl's fascia, which fuse laterally to form the lateroconal fascia or the ligament. Superiorly, these layers fuse above the adrenal gland and attach to the diaphragm. And there's this abbreviation that can help you remember the contents of the space, and it's CAR with a K. So, which is kidneys, adrenal gland, and the renal vessels. Um, there's also perirenal fat that is present here, which is also called the adipose capsule of the kidneys, can also be regarded as the part of the perirenal space. It's not that important, but you can still include it. The anterior pararenal space is bounded by the posterior layer of the peritoneum and the anterior leaf of the renal fascia. It contains pancreas, ascending and descending colon, and most of the duodenum. I'll be explaining why I haven't mentioned about it being completely retroperitoneal later in the video, right? So, moving on, the posterior pararenal space is bounded by the posterior leaf of the renal fascia and the transversalis fascia. Its medial border is formed by psoas major and quadratus lumborum muscles. And it's very easy to remember this layer contains only fat. Okay? Hmm. Now the next topic or the last topic related to retroperitoneum is the development of its organs. Retroperitoneal structures can be either primary retroperitoneal or secondary retroperitoneal. Primary retroperitoneal structures are structures retroperitoneal in the entirety of development, whereas secondary retroperitoneal structures are the structures that initially were suspended in mesentery and later migrated behind the peritoneum during development. Basically, primary organs knew where they belonged and chose to stay put, but secondary ones were confused for a while, but eventually ended up coming behind the peritoneum. Okay? So, like in this diagram, this is an intraperitoneal organ which is attached to the mesentery, and during embryogenesis, the mesentery gets attached to the parietal peritoneum and eventually migrates behind it. Similarly, you have the gut tube and the mesentery here. It gets attached on the parietal layer, so there's a fusion of visceral and parietal layers, and eventually the layers get absorbed, and there's absorption of fused visceral and parietal layers, and this organ becomes retroperitoneal. Um, Now, what structures are primary retroperitoneal and what structures are secondary retroperitoneal? Primary structures include kidneys, adrenal and ureter from the urinary part, aorta and inferior vena cava from the circulatory part. Now, from this previous diagram, you remember that this space is known as the perirenal space, which contains kidneys, adrenal glands which are located above the kidneys like a cap, the ureter right here, aorta, inferior vena cava, aorta and inferior vena cava. So you can remember that primary retroperitoneal structures or organs are mostly from the perirenal space. Okay, and these along with esophagus and the rectum form the primary retroperitoneal organs. Um, but there's a slight twist here. Remember that the thoracic esophagus is intraperitoneal, whereas the abdominal esophagus is retroperitoneal. And with rectum, technically it's subperitoneal because it lies below the peritoneum, but does classify as retro too. So, like, if you're still confused, I can show you here. Organs that are present here are called retroperitoneal, and the organs that are present below the peritoneal are called subperitoneal. Peritoneum. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So that was about primary retroperitoneal, and for the secondary retroperitoneal organs, we have pancreas, duodenum, large intestine. Okay, only these three that you need to remember. Um, we know that anatomically pancreas has a head, neck, body, and a tail. Except the tail, the other three parts of the pancreas are retroperitoneal. The tail is intraperitoneal. Coming to the duodenum, its anatomic divisions divided into four parts. Okay, this forms your first part, second, third, and fourth. Except the first part, the entire duodenum is retroperitoneal. That's why we say most of the duodenum is retroperitoneum. Okay. Now, in the large intestine, ascending colon, descending colon, and rectum are retro, whereas um, cecum, transverse colon, and sigmoid colon are intraperitoneal. And that was the end of the embryology of the retroperitoneal structures. Now, the next slide is just an overview of all the organs belonging in this space. Y'all can use the mnemonic SAT-Booker to remember all of these. So S for suprarenal glands, aorta and inferior vena cava, duodenum, second and third part, also the fourth part, um, pancreas except the tail, ureters, colon descending and ascending, kidneys, esophagus, and rectum. And that's the end. I hope you all understood the topic, and if there's any doubt, feel free to contact me. All the very best for your finals. Thank you. Bye bye.